Welcome back to part two on outsourcing your problems away. And in the first part, we talked about a lot of the specifics on how to actually get a VA, what you can actually do with your VA. In the second part, we're going to go over how you should give them tasks and some pitfalls to look out for. And finally, we'll end with a good conclusion. But before we get started in this, Joel, you said something in part one that I thought was really interesting. And you said you recommend getting virtual assistants from the Philippines. Why the Philippines over other places?
Well, there's I guess, personal answer to that and a practical, pragmatic answer to that. The personal answer to that is I enjoy spending time in Southeast Asia. I really resonate with that part of the world. I find the people to be, as a rule, incredibly kind and welcoming and soft-spoken, and just easier to work with than many Western countries, for example. But I'll also add this caveat that nothing is for free. And one of the challenges in working with people in Southeast Asia, specifically the Philippines, is they are incredibly passive. So it is a culture that really frowns upon being overtly aggressive. If you're seen to lose your temper, it's a sign of weakness. It's not something to pride yourself on. It's really the antithesis of the States. And one of the problems can be that your VA, Filipino VA, will often be afraid to share their opinion with you. Even if they see something that might need to be improved, it could be, in their culture, be interpreted as being disrespectful. So one thing, I've mentioned Penny so many times, who is my original rock star, I call her virtual assistant. And one of the things that attracted me to her the most was she was really outgoing, in a completely respectful way, but she was happy to share her opinion on things that had worked for her previous clients in the past. And she was not afraid to say no and make suggestions. So that's something I really encourage people to ask for, and kind of feel out when you do that initial Skype interview when you're talking with someone, is you don't want them to be passive. There's one I a staff member we have, and we just had a meeting about her today, and we've asked her now 2 times. This was the third time, asking her to be more forward with opinions. Don't have to wait for us to ask her multiple times, is there something we can improve? Do you have a suggestion? Feel free and feel safe enough to be outgoing. So again, pros and cons. The great thing about the Philippines is there's very little ego, and they're very happy to work and partner with you, and they're very kind people. The other side of that coin is sometimes they're often too passive, and especially for an entrepreneur who's trying to get things done and themselves have their ego in check enough where they can ask for help, you have to make sure you have a VA that's willing to help. But the other reason, so that's a personal reason. The pragmatic reason is I spend a lot of time in Southeast Asia. I like it there. And a lot of people have set up virtual assistant staffing solutions in the Philippines. Part of the reason is the technology is pretty good. The infrastructure is pretty good. Meaning some of the other places, for example, I've done individual tasks with women in Pakistan, believe it or not. And sometimes on 2 of those tasks, there were a couple of problems with internet issues. Nothing big, but just we had to reschedule meetings and stuff like this. My experience has been in the Philippines. It's westernized enough that the technological infrastructure is there, and the educational infrastructure is there because they also learn English in elementary school. So you will find that the quality of English speaking is incredibly high. Again, another kudos to Penny. Her English is in fact so good that she was a journalist and wrote for English speaking papers. So between the ease in communication, with English being my native tongue, English being taught in school there, so it's a second language they use, and technological infrastructure in place. In addition, the cost of living. You have a weird confluence of technology that's available to them, and simultaneously cost of living is very low. So, it's not impossible for you to have a MBA educated person who could write a business plan for you for $10 or $15 an hour. that really is possible in that part of the world. So just a confluence of kind of coincidences and preferences led me to the Philippines. But that said, I encourage the audience to ask around and try something different. Travis, what has been your experience with the Philippines? Why did you choose the Philippines?
I've heard from a number of different people actually that's the place to go, and there's a couple different reasons. One, the English qualities seems to be the best out of any of the countries that you can outsource from, more or less. Also, I think the internet quality seems like they have pretty good internet quality. Also, I've heard many times from many different people, and I've found it to be true, that people in the Philippines are extremely loyal. And I told my VA when
Yeah.
she started, like, look, I only want you to have one job. If with me, if you need more money, let me know. I'll find more tasks for you to do. I'll give you more hours, but I don't want you getting a part-time job. And recently, she asked me, she got offered a teaching position at her school, and she asked me, hey, I turned down their full-time position because I'm working with you, but could I have a
Hmm.
part-time position there? And I told her, let me think about it. And before I could even, I had like 2 minutes to think about it. She's like, don't worry about it, sir. I won't take it. And I'm like, I don't want to crush your dream. So I made sure. I'm like, look, if you need more work, if it's just about the money, I can give you more work. And she's like, I don't even really want it that bad. It's okay. And I made sure that she didn't want to become a teacher or anything like that. And she's like, no, I just you know, might have wanted more stuff to do. So it was the loyalty I really liked. The fact that she was willing to say, you know what, if you don't want me to have another job, I won't take one. And if I was in her shoes, and I think most Americans would just take the job anyways, not even tell their boss. I'm not going to find out. And I really respected the fact that she told me, hey, I have this second job. What do you think? So that's been big.
It's interesting you mentioned loyalty because about 2 months ago, the village Penny was living in had a freak tsunami, not tsunami, flood, and her apartment was ruined. And she showed up for a meeting, virtual meeting, on time, having carried her laptop and computer equipment over her head through waist deep water to get to the meeting on time. And that's the level of loyalty. Here's a woman, we've not met in person. We've only met on Skype and worked digitally, virtually for months now. And she showed up on time for a meeting, having waded through a disaster zone. And I've had domestic, um, either business associates or employees who wouldn't show up for meetings because they got hung over the night before
Hmm.
or because traffic was really bad. So they are an amazingly loyal, wonderful culture. So, but again, I encourage people to explore, maybe try different cultures. But at the end of the day, why reinvent the wheel? The Philippines really does seem to be the place to go.
Yeah, I did a lot of research before I finally picked that, and I heard it from so many different people that didn't necessarily have an agenda in place. So I would
Hmm.
recommend it, but sure, absolutely look at different places. So let's get into actually how you utilize your VA, the specifics. How do you give them tasks and stuff like that? I'll share first the way that I give my VA tasks,
Please.
and I use Dropbox, Google Spreadsheets, and Screencast. So what I'll do is we share a Dropbox, and I recommend if you have Dropbox, go on Fiverr. For $5, you can get 16 friends to sign up, and you'll get 16 gigs. It's not technically totally legitimate, but it's a good little hack, and it's a way to use Fiverr at the same time.
Hmm.
So we share a Dropbox together, and I have all the screencasts I do. So I'll record my screen saying, "Hey, I'm doing this Photoshop thing. I need you to do it 100 times in different colors or whatever." Explain it to her, and then it automatically uploads to the Dropbox. She looks at it, and at the same time, I use a Google spreadsheet where I have a list of tasks, and I say what the name of the task is, some notes on it, and then what priority it is. And I use one, two, or three. One means you need to get this done ASAP. Two is like the next priority down, like get this done when you can. And three is if you have extra time, get to this, but it's nothing that needs to be done right now. In that Google spreadsheet, I always also have things such as recurring tasks. So every Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, I need her to do these things. Every Monday, it's I need her to do this, whatever. That way, I don't have to constantly repopulate the top part with tasks. And the Dropbox is awesome because she'll do, for instance, Photoshop stuff for me, put it in the Dropbox, and I have it right on my computer. There's no emailing, no anything like that. How about you? What is some techniques and tips you found?
Well, I think later in the podcast, we're going to talk about a lot of these tools, but it's interesting that everyone I talk to basically uses the same tools. And one reason I think is because they're free, with the exception of Dropbox. If you're taking up a ton of memory, you might have to pay. But again, that's a great hack that you just offered going on Fiverr and getting friends, quote, friends to sign up. But let me take a step back and say that every failure that I have seen myself in using a virtual assistant originated with me. And the earliest failures were from me not having an organized task list. The worst thing you can do to these people is send them an email where you just dump your brain in that email and expect them to somehow decipher that and prioritize it and magically figure it out. That's just totally unrealistic. That's unrealistic of anybody, whether it's domestic or you're working with them virtually. So we use the same tools. We love Dropbox, and recently we didn't even have to upgrade Dropbox. And recently we've added clients and stuff who have big video files, for example, doing video editing, and obviously we have to use the paid service on Dropbox. I love Google Docs. Whether it's building a spreadsheet for tasks, whether it's just taking some notes in Google Docs, whether it's sharing content with your virtual assistant so that you can either edit together while sharing a screen, or just send it to them and have them work overnight so that you have a completed task in your inbox in the morning. Google Drive is awesome. The other tool that we use, also free, it's both free and is a service called Redbooth. And we use Redbooth. And the great thing about Redbooth is that it is a task management purpose-built software. So there's nothing that Redbooth does that you couldn't figure out and create on your own, say in a task list or survey form in Google Drive. The great thing about Redbooth is that it allows you to invite people to work on certain projects and not others. So maybe you have a case where one of your virtual assistants is working on project A, but it's not appropriate for them to know about or work on project B. You can have separate tasks set up with different levels of access granted to both. The other great thing is you can set schedules and daily reminders so that your virtual assistant in their email box will get a reminder, hey, there's an impending deadline coming. This task needs to be done. They click on the link in their inbox and boom, they're ported into Redbooth where they can see what needs to be done. The other thing is it allows you to create projects, tasks, and subtasks. So we've been talking about tasks, but if we really break it down and get kind of nuanced about it, what we basically have are projects. And for projects to get completed, tasks have to get completed. And within each of those tasks, there's subtasks, right? So the great thing about Redbooth is you can create a project, again, invite who you want or don't allow who you want to see the project, assign tasks, assign deadlines, and as a task is completed, a check is made in the little checkbox. And then you, as the employer, get a notification, hey, task A of project B was completed at such and such a time. So it's really cool. You can kind of see, you can actually see progress being made as your little green check marks start stacking up and you get closer to your goals. So that's Redbooth. And again, it's totally free, redbooth.com. Check that out. But circling back to the beginning of the podcast where we talked about thinking algorithmically and systematically, which I really love that you brought that up. The great thing about whether you use a Google Drive spreadsheet or use Redbooth or Basecamp, whatever it is, it just forces you to think systematically. And that alone, I think, is worth the price of admission, even though the price of admission is free for those services. But I really like the task management software because it forces the employer to get clear, forces the employer to monitor how that time is being spent, and it's free. So why not do it?
So how much is Redbooth? Redbooth's
Free.
free? Wow.
Yep.
I need to look into that. And
Yep. I'll send you the link and I'll even share the screen with you. I don't know if we'll do that for this podcast. Maybe it's not appropriate, but it's a great service.
Cool. Very cool. And what's Basecamp like? I've heard a lot about it, but I've never actually used
You
it.
know what? I've heard a lot about it too, and like you, I've never used it. I got started with Red Booth, and again, everybody liked Red Booth. The virtual assistants like it. I understand it now, and as the clients come on board, they like it and they understand it. In fact, one of the more recent clients, he was a Basecamp advocate, but he's kind of turned the corner. He likes Red Booth. So again, totally up to the audience what they think is best. But I encourage you to check out Red Booth just because it's free and it seems to get the job done.
And one other tool you talked about was Jing. What's Jing?
Jing is a free, again, like these other services, it's free depending on how much data you use. But Jing is simply a service, or rather a software that was introduced again by the virtual assistants. A great example of the virtual assistant telling you what they need to get the job done. And it's just a screen capture. And what it does is for the free software, it limits you to capturing 5 minutes of screen capture. So again, by sort of putting that fuse, it forces you, as we again talked about, to think more algorithmically and systematically. How am I going to explain in 5 minutes or less how to get this task done? So it kind of puts a gun to your head and forces you to really think clearly. And the great thing about it is that you can share that video in two ways. You can download the file, upload it to Dropbox, for example, or you can simply share a link so it doesn't take up any hard drive space, and you simply share that link with anyone you want, and they can stream and watch the video as many times as they want. And by capturing the video, like you talked about, you create essentially a library of system operations for your business so that in the event a VA leaves, maybe your VA takes that teaching job, you're not starting over from scratch. As you work, you do something one time, you explain a task, and you begin to build up a video catalog of how tasks get done. So you're essentially creating an educational service for any future VAs. And it's just yet another way for you as the employer to take yourself out of repeating tasks unnecessarily.
That's awesome. Now, that kind of reminds me of another question I had, which is how do you keep track of the time that your VAs work? Do you just completely trust them, or what do you do?
I did completely trust them. As things have become more sophisticated and there's more time and people to manage, they use a time management software and slash invoicing software called Zoho. Now this brings up, a question about monitoring time. So there's two ways to get someone to do something. You get them to do it and then promise to pay them, which I think is kind of unfair to ask of someone. The other way is you take a risk as employer and you pay them up front, trusting that they'll get the task done. I knew it was important for me to build into the relationship with my VA, even before it got all sophisticated with Zen Virtual Assistants. This is just when I was, working one-on-one with the VA, is I wanted to lead with a culture that said, I trust you to get something done. So I would, contrary to the advice of many, I would pay them up front. I would have a task that I expected done on a certain day, and I would pay them up front and pay them weekly. And that worked great for me. But again, it only worked great for me because I, at that point, had a virtual assistant like Penny, a virtual assistant like Kriza, really hugely experienced and ethical people who I think the audience will find, again, working in the Philippines, very, very ethical. I have not heard of anything unethical going on, like data being stolen or anything like that. In fact, the only time I hear stories like that, it's from American
Yeah, I was
virtual
gonna say.
assistants
Yeah.
who are doing that. So to give you a level, or give the audience an indication of the level of trust that I have in virtual assistants, specifically in the Philippines, is sometimes I have to ask them what my login is for an email account or a social media account. I trust them explicitly, and I've never been let down yet. So to answer your question, how do you track time? I think that's a personal thing. I'll share very briefly. Kriza, our team leader, she used to work full-time for another Australian client, I think it was. And they had some sort of monitoring software on her computer where they could essentially peek at her screen at any time unannounced, anonymously, random, and see if she was working on their tasks. And here's why that just sends chills up my spine for two ways. One, because as an employer, your job is to delegate, trust that it gets done, and then focus on things that bring in revenue. If you're looking over their shoulder, you're not doing something that's bringing in revenue. That's A. And B, what does that say to the people you're working for? I trust you so little that I need to be able to peek over your shoulder and make sure you're not screwing me out of 5 to 10 minutes. I just don't want to have that kind of relationship with anybody. I like setting a task, a deadline, and whether you do it tomorrow or 5 minutes before it gets done, as long as it gets done, I don't care how it gets done. Um, just make sure it gets done. And I'm not going to be Big Brother watching over you. So that's a long answer to how to monitor time, which I can now see didn't really answer your question about how to monitor time. But I would encourage the audience to trust the people, especially when dealing with them in the Philippines, and know that they're incredibly honest. And you don't need a bunch of Big Brother oversight nonsense.
I'll tell you the method I used. I tried a bunch of different things out at different times. At one point, I was going to use one of those, like every 6 minutes, it takes like a picture, like a screenshot of their
Right,
computer. And my VA said that it slowed down her computer. And the truth is, I wasn't going to look at those screenshots anyways, unless there's a problem. So recently, what I started doing is just she sends me a daily email of what she did in that day. And I'm actually probably going to move this into just a spreadsheet. But recently in that
exactly.
daily email, what I have her do is tell me how long did you spend on each task, and it came in handy a couple times. One time, I found that she spent 2 hours on a task that should have took 10 minutes, and I'm like, hey, what happened here? And I forget what the reason was, but she's like, you know what, sir, you're right. It shouldn't have taken me that long. I'm gonna work an extra 2 hours this weekend. I'm like, wow, okay, that's pretty cool. But it is nice to know general ideas. All right, if someone's taking 10 hours on something that should take 10 minutes, there
Right.
might be a problem. It might not even just be that they're being unethical. It might be that, hey, what do you think that I want you to do? Because something's wrong here. So it also makes me, I think that there's a good nature to being basically like, hey, I am interested in what you're doing. It's not just like, go off, do your own thing. Because I know personally, and maybe that's the problem, is I would take advantage of the system. I am the worst employee. And knowing that, it's hard for me to be an employer because I'm like, if I was that person, I'd be screwing around. And my VA is much more ethical than I am. But in my head, I'm like, how would I keep myself honest?
I think you strike a nice balance between just giving them carte blanche to do anything and being like an overbearing employer over their shoulder in having weekly reports. And that's ultimately where we settle that kind of common ground is again using the aforementioned Red Booth is we have weekly reports. So I can simply go into Red Booth, I can see what is done, if it was done on time, and if it's not, then we adjust as necessary. But there needs to be accountability, as you point out, but at the same time, giving them the trust to get something done, I think they appreciate it as well.
Yeah, and another random thing that I've noticed personally, both in my own life and working with my VA, is keep them busy. I think if there's too much downtime, like I had a week or two where I just told my VA, go out and find emails, which is very monotonous, repetitive, and boring.
Mm,
And I could tell that her work ethic was slacking because she wasn't getting that many emails in. But as soon as I give her real tasks to do, she gets them done like way earlier than I would expect. And that's the same thing I found when I quit my job. When I left, I told them, your flaw was not giving me enough to do. I told them like, look, I'm an early 20 something year old with a ton of energy and a ton of drive, but if you don't have enough trust in me to give me real big tasks, I I learned slowly over time that this isn't what I want to do. If that my boss would have kept me busy constantly, I never would have even been able to think, hey, is this what I want to be doing with my life? Because I'd be so busy thinking about things that I need to get done. So I think, yeah,
Isn't it also interesting how any of us, I guess I'm speaking for myself, I shouldn't project this onto the audience or you, but if I have two things to get done during the day, it might take me all day to do those two things. There have been days, especially recently, where really my calendar is filled up in 30-minute blocks and I get everything done.
Mhm.
So again, there's something about getting that momentum going. And not only, if I have two things to do, I'm lazy to get out of bed. If I have 20 things to do, not only am I out of bed early, but I do yoga to set the day right and I get things done. So I think if we can share one thing with the audience is don't underestimate how capable a lot of these people are, and especially how creative they are. And if you underwhelm them, there is definitely fine balance between too little and too few daily tasks.
Yeah, and another thing I'd like to recommend, I try to ask my VA, and we kind of talked about this a little earlier in the episode, but we'll have once a month or once every 2 months even just a Skype call, and I'll ask her like, what can we improve? What do you like doing?
Mhm.
You have to be a boss. You have to think, what would you want your boss to say to you? And I ask her what she doesn't like doing too, but the truth is, I usually need her to do that kind of stuff anyways. But it's good to know what kind of tasks do these people, your VAs, anybody that's working for you, what do they really enjoy doing? And try to give them more of that if you can.
This might be a bit off the topic, but it has to do with incentivizing people. So obviously, we're talking about virtual assistants that most of the time are going to be compensated either in one of two ways: pay by the hour or pay by the task. The other thing that I experimented with Zen virtual assistants is I gave equity to the virtual assistants working in the company. So instead of them being paid by the hour, we're all kind of in this together and we have to find ways to make it work. And we're all going to, if it works, we're all going to share. And what I thought is that there would be a huge increase in the level of productivity by having this equity carrot dangling in front of these people who are formerly quote employees. And part to my pleasant surprise and part to my disappointment, it didn't make any difference at all. I found that when they were just being paid by the hour, they really sincerely were working hard and doing a good job. And now that they have equity in the company, they're doing just as good of a job. But one thing the audience might want to experiment with is sharing equity, either in their project or a paid product or something like that, and seeing if they get more productivity out of their VA.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It actually reminds me, and this is off topic, but it reminded me of this TED talk I watched that timed people on how long it took them to complete a task based on monetary rewards. And they found that the higher the monetary reward is, it made people do certain tasks faster, such as manual labor or brute force type things. But intellectual activities with more money, their performance actually went down. And
That's interesting.
yeah, and there's a couple different ideas on why that is. I think when there's more money involved, people almost overthink the task and it kind of
Hmm.
stresses them out. But when there's money involved and it's a hard working task, you have a lot more energy and you want to get it done right away and it kind of focuses you in. Where intellectual tasks, you don't necessarily always want to be focused, you want to be somewhat creative as well. So I think the key is to play with that, you know. But at the end of the day, I think if you can keep someone happy with what they're doing, that's almost better than a lot of monetary incentives.
And keeping happy is a big part of it because we've all had employment that we were not happy at, and we all know how productive we were
Yeah.
when we were working for people we didn't like. And just being kind and nice goes so far. It's just remember as you start working with a virtual assistant, remember how you felt when you had to do things for people who you didn't particularly like and weren't particularly nice to you. Being kind goes a long, long way, especially in that culture of Southeast Asia where kindness is so applauded and rewarded. You being a bull in a china closet yelling does not make you seem like a strong and focused business leader. It makes you, or you are viewed as someone who has lost control and someone who is actually lacking power rather than projecting power. So keep that cultural difference in mind as well.
It, I completely agreed. Now, before we move on to some pitfalls and some things to look out for with your virtual assistants, is there any other things that you recommend using, any tools that you recommend using with your virtual assistant?
I say, why overcomplicate it? You have Google Drive, which is great. It's free. It's easy to use. You have things like Jing. If you have a Mac, you already have a built-in screen capture system. Jing, again, of course, is nice because it's free, but also you can simply share a link of the video you took. And Skype. We are talking on Skype. Skype is free unless you upgrade to the Skype Premium, which allows you to share multiple screens or something like that. But we still use free Skype. We've had half a dozen people on a call sharing a screen. It's free. It works great. And again, Redbooth. Redbooth, it's free, seems to work great, and a great way for not only the employer to organize projects, tasks, and subtasks, set deadlines, invite who you want to invite, don't invite who you want to not invite, and see those green check boxes fill up as your project gets completed.
Have you used LastPass, by the way?
No, is that the password? The password?
Yeah, and actually, when you were
Yeah.
talking about having to ask your virtual assistant what your password is,
Yep.
that's what I was thinking. And there's a friend of mine actually told me one thing you can do, and I think it's like 9.99 a year, super cheap. You can get a family plan where you can give out your passwords to other people, but they don't actually know what they are. So when you're first hiring a VA, if you want to give them access to things that you might need to take away, that's something you can look at because it.
Yeah, yes, that's one thing I forgot to add to this list. I don't use that just because of the level of trust I have, but we have had other clients who do request it,
Mhm.
and it does work, and it works really well. Occasionally, there's kind of a hiccup because, again, I believe the passwords change. So the virtual assistant will be assigned a password to do a task. They might need to get back into whether it's an email or WordPress or blog a week later, and all of a sudden they have to ask for the password again. So it can create some frictions and some wasted time. But again, if you're dealing with content that's proprietary and that's important to you, then LastPass is a great option.
See, I actually heard that when you change your password, assuming you're using it right, it'll auto change it for everybody within your quote unquote family. And the other thing, I use it on my own because it just saves time. I never type in a password. Well, I rarely type in a password anymore. Like when I log into my e-commerce page, I don't do anything. It just auto logs in for me. I go to bdancer.com slash, my account or whatever, and it does everything for me. So that's another tool I would look to use. So now let's move on to the next subject. Is there anything, we've already talked about a bunch of them, but is there anything you'd really recommend not using a virtual assistant or hiring someone outside for?
Well, the obvious answer, kind of tongue-in-cheek answer, is anything that requires a physical presence for. Obviously, you can't hire a virtual assistant for. I have been amazed at how amazingly capable and competent working with virtual assistants has been, and how easy it's been to communicate and work and collaborate with someone literally on the opposite side of the planet and working in a different time zone. With the way my business is currently structured and the what I desire, simply don't need a physical person in my office. That might be different for people. Maybe you have a brick and mortar business and there's pickups that need to be accomplished in your region or in your town. Obviously, a virtual assistant cannot help with that. But one thing the virtual assistant does is it forces you to look at more scalable businesses because by nature of working with a virtual assistant, you have to find something that's largely virtual. The more virtual something is, the more potential eyeballs can get on it, and the more potential passive income you can build. So it forces you, for example, to think less about how can I get more people in my brick and mortar restaurant, and maybe get you thinking, hey, how can I get some passive income
Hmm.
around my restaurant from online? Maybe I should stop figuring out ways to serve more spaghetti and figure out a way to build an online e-store or brand where I sell spaghetti sauce, if that makes sense. So again, obviously, you need someone to walk your dog and brush your teeth and pick up flowers around the corner. That's not going to help with a virtual assistant. But that said, if you are even a busy family member, let's say you're a stay-at-home mother and you're just busy and you're raising a bunch of kids. What could you possibly do with a virtual assistant? Well, here's a couple things. You could have them book doctor's appointments. You could have them manage your calendar. You could have them order food, have food show up. You could have them order cards or flowers sent to people. Anything that would require you to sit down in front of a computer or pick up a phone is something that even somebody who doesn't have a job could outsource to a virtual assistant for 1 or 2 hours a day and have way more time either A, with their children, or B, away from their children, just to get a break. So don't be afraid to be creative, and don't be afraid to ask virtual assistants what they think they can do, even if it's something that you don't think is compatible with a virtual assistant.
Yeah, one of my favorite stories about outsourcing is from Tim Ferriss, and he actually outsourced his dating life. He hired a bunch of different teams to go on eHarmony, a bunch of different websites, and schedule him dates. And then I guess one weekend he had 20 dates, 10 on Saturday, 10 on Sunday, or something like that, and went to just a
Mhm.
bunch of different cafes, meeting all these girls that he didn't even talk to beforehand. And I
Yep.
thought, I mean, that shows you can really, anything you can do online, you can hire someone to do.
It's true. We have a client who wants different meals ordered and delivered to his house at different times. As you know, you can do shopping on Amazon, and he just wants groceries delivered to his house. So part of his task, unrelated to his business, is instead of him going to Amazon and shopping, he outsources it to the virtual assistants, and he's got groceries waiting for him when he gets home.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I will say there's a couple things I personally do not recommend outsourcing. And number one on my list is SEO, unless you know the person and you trust the person, because I've heard a lot of horror stories and I personally had this happen to me. Now, there's always obviously exceptions, but unless you're telling the person what you want to get done specifically that will help with your SEO. If you just hire someone off Elance to do SEO, I've gone through Elance and there's no one there that I really would recommend. And I actually hired someone, and my traffic was about 100 people per day coming organically to my website. And then
Mhm.
after I hired them, after about a week when everything got indexed, it dropped to 25 people per day. And I got pissed. I told them, you need to delete all the links that you put on there. And it went back up as soon as they deleted all the links, back to 100.
Wow.
Yeah. And the reason is they're doing stuff that used to work. And I did find one guy who I think what he was doing kind of worked, but it was shady. Basically, what he was doing was spinning articles, meaning there were nonsense articles, putting them on a bunch of different blogs that he owned. It's called a PBN, and the articles weren't that great, and it might fool Google for now, but Google's becoming really smart. And I personally believe the best way to increase SEO is to do it in a way that if you were to go to like the CEO of Google and say, "Here's what I'm doing," they'd be like, "Yeah, that's exactly what you're supposed to be doing." Reaching out to other people, getting your links in organic ways. So SEO, be very careful with what you're doing. Spammy stuff doesn't work anymore.
The other way I've heard of people, and this is probably just common sense, but using virtual assistants to boost their Twitter follower list or social media follower list, and then that virtual assistant will go on, like Fiverr, for example, and do one of those packages where buy 10,000 Twitter followers,
Mhm.
but they're not real followers. And that's another way that I think would be a misuse, not only misuse of time and money, but a misuse of virtual assistant is to have them and say, find me 30,000 Twitter followers.
Yeah. I agree. I've had my virtual assistant, for instance, follow other people on Twitter that I think are relevant. I'll give her a list, and I think that's okay, and it
Oh,
works
that's
out.
organic. Yeah, I'm talking
Yeah,
about, these
the fake
kind of
ones.
shady packages, the
Yeah,
fake ones.
the
Yeah.
fake people. You're right. It's 100%. It's a waste of your money. I think if you really need to, for instance, on Facebook, if you really want to get Facebook followers, do a little bit of research into the paid ads. You can do it. I got likes for 3 cents a piece, and it's not just a like. It's someone that's finding out about your business for 3 cents. They might not come
Hmm.
up to your website and buy anything, but for 3 cents, for highly targeted people, I targeted people that only like my competitors, that are in the that have a daughter that dances and are in a higher income bracket. for 3 cents a piece, you better bet that I'd let them know about my website. And on top of that, I get a like, so it looks nice.
That's a great tip.
Another thing I personally don't like to hire VA people for is extremely creative stuff or stuff where English needs to be your primary language, unless that person speaks English fluently. And I've made this mistake with my VA. I had her write articles for my blog thinking, oh, it should be really easy because she writes really good English when me and her are talking. But it was a little too much for her, and it doesn't read like a native English speaker because
Exactly.
she's not a
Yeah.
native English speaker.
That's an excellent point, and I made that same mistake as well, where I outsourced managing social media, specifically responding to people and stuff like that, to a particularly not poor but less than ideal English speaker. And again, that's just another example of that's not their fault. That's our fault as employers, assigning them an incongruent and incompatible task. So, yes, again, anything that requires your voice as a strong English speaker, it's amazing how sensitive we are in reading someone's words. We can tell if it's their voice or not, isn't it? Especially if we know that person, and especially if we've had some time reading, it really stands out as the syntax changes. So again, if it's important for you as the employer or either blog owner to have it be your voice, but the busy stuff you can outsource to someone else. But yeah,
Yeah.
good point.
And I think sometimes you can make ways, for instance, every time we have a new article on our blog, we post something saying, hey, here's our new article. But that first sentence, I don't want to always say, hey, here's our new article. I want to switch it up, make it. And when I write it, it's always unique because, I'm going to put a lot of effort into it. And I
Mm,
recently realized my VA is more or less always saying the same thing. Hey, here's our new article. And that's my fault. I need to tell her. So what I'm going to do now is go and tell her, here's a list of 20 opening lines for that blog post.
exactly.
Just cycle through them because I don't think any of our followers are going to go through 20 and be like, hey, wait a minute, they've said this before. So
Yep.
there's always ways around this kind of stuff.
And again, it comes back to the employer, A, taking responsibility, and B, beginning to think systematically. That's just a perfect example of instead of having to send an email to your VA and say, oh, by the way, open the sentence of today's blog post with X, just build a spreadsheet. So
Mhm.
you have, 10 openers exactly and cycle through them. That's just another way of beginning to think systematically.
Yeah. And I think the last thing that I want to mention is that even though we're talking about how much trust we have in our VAs, it didn't start from day one. At least for
Right.
me, from day one, I didn't hire him and say, hey, here's access to my PayPal account and my bank
Yep.
accounts and all this kind of stuff. You got to feel the person out. Use some common sense. Don't give them access to anything that you wouldn't give anybody else access to. They're still a random person that you haven't met until you establish that trust with them.
And if you are going to give access to sort of a, petty cash, virtual petty cash type of situation to your VA, just be smart. Again, first of all, that's a huge step. That's kind of the final step in cementing the relationship with the VAs when they can actually spend your money without you giving them permission. But if you're going to do that, look, just do it in one of two ways. Open a brand new credit card and put a limit on it, 500 bucks or something like that, or PayPal. Give them access to a dedicated PayPal that they can use, but again, put 200 bucks in it. So again, it just comes to limiting your downside and not being careless and stupid, quite frankly. But yes, that is kind of the final step. Once you've actually trusted your VA enough to hand over the money, um, that's a huge step. That's a big step for anybody, but it's also a really cool step because it gives them some autonomy, especially again if you create rules, systematic rules. You don't need to contact me if you buy anything less than $20. If you think it's going to help your job, help you get this task done, just go for it. And if it's more than $20, send me a message and we'll talk about it.
That's awesome. Actually, what that reminded me of another tip that I have is something that I've made the mistake of. Talk with your VAs every once in a while. I went like 3 months without Skyping with my VA, and I
Mm,
noticed her productivity was going down. So I scheduled a meeting with her, and I'm like, hey, what's going on? And I think just having that conversation, she remembers, oh, yeah, he's a real person. Like, he's a
this
cool
is a
guy.
person, right?
Yeah. Because if it's always just interacting with a computer, if a computer's your boss, you don't really have any sympathy. You don't really care as much. And
Mhm.
although people from the Philippines are very generous and nice people and honest, same with lots of people in the world, you just need to remind them that, hey, I'm a real person. So
And it's also reciprocal. Treat them like a real person. Be nice to
absolutely.
them, extend trust to them. And it's just a reciprocal thing. As I mentioned earlier in the podcast, maybe it was or is ill advised. Maybe it seems crazy to you, but I led with giving them trust right from the beginning. I'm
Mhm.
going to pay you ahead of time for something I expect to get done. And that level of trust was appreciated, especially as some of those VAs have come from the aforementioned clients who are always looking over their shoulder. And in some cases, this is totally grotesque, not paying them, promising I'll pay you in 2 weeks, just finish this task, just finish this other task, and then just running off and not paying them. And it's just gross because, I mean, here uh, is a culture of people with a very low cost of living. Often these are women or people who are supporting their parents, maybe a child, and I don't think I need to tell your audience this, but just pay them. I mean, for goodness sakes, that's ridiculous. And I think leading with payment and leading with trust is a great way to start any relationship on the right foot.
Absolutely. So we've covered a lot in both
I
these
know.
parts. Is there anything else you want to add before we come to a close here?
No, this has been so valuable, and you've actually inspired me to put together a video series of everything that we're talking about. Utilize a lot of these tools like, screen capture and stuff like that, show some workflow, interview different VAs, because the only thing that, speaking for myself, that kept me from taking that leap into trying a virtual assistant was fear of the unknown, and there were so few resources about how best to work with a VA. You, like I, were introduced to the idea of virtual assistants through Tim Ferriss's book 4 Hour Work Week, and it had some great case studies about how virtual assistants work. But there definitely was nothing as in depth of what you and I just did over this 2 part series to like show the pros and cons, different types of VAs, different types of VA services, different software to use. So putting something together in video form, you've really inspired me to do that. So I'd like to thank you for having me on the podcast, not only for this one, but for the original, your inaugural podcast.
I appreciate it. And I just want to conclude this with saying hire a virtual assistant today. Whether it's someone off Fiverr and you just want a
Mhm.
quick task done, maybe you have a programming task, go to Elance, take the
Yep.
dive, go to onlinejobs.ph, get a full-time person. I still remember the day that I signed in and did that. It's changed my life. Or if you want to contact Joel at Zen Virtual Assistants and get a whole team, do it today. It's literally, I don't care what small step you do, it will change the way you look at work and you'll get value right from the beginning from it. You'll completely change, you'll shift the way you think about it. It's completely a liberating experience. And on that note, anything before we end the episode?
I'd just like to close. Thank you again for having me, and thanks for mentioning Zen Virtual Assistants. And know that Zen Virtual Assistants offers a free Skype consultation. So anybody who's considering virtual assistants on how to either work with a staff or team of virtual assistants, or you just have a one-off task, we have a totally free chat. You go to zenvirtualassistants.com, you'll see the little box. You can either have a digital chat with the pop-up, or you can schedule a free Skype chat and speak with the virtual assistants and ask them questions. And it's totally free.
Well, there you go. There's no reason not to try and get started today. Thank you, Joel, so much for coming on again. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, man. I'm so proud of you with this podcast, and it's just you're doing it. You're doing the work. It went from an idea to a very, very real thing in about 45 days. So good for you.
Well, appreciate it. Thanks.
All right, take care. Bye, everyone.
That was Joel Nelson over at Zen Virtual Assistants. And if you liked what we talked about there, make sure you check out the first episode I did with him because it really goes in depth into his story. And he has an extremely interesting story. He had millions of dollars, tons of women in his life, everything that people think they want. But yet he gave it all up, gave away all his possessions, and went and studied Buddhism, did meditation and yoga every day for about 3 years. And he shares some of the lessons he learned through that experience. And if you like this episode, make sure you subscribe. You can either subscribe on my YouTube channel or on iTunes. Make sure you tell some other people, share the message, and you can email me at travis@howtodoyour20s.com with any future ideas you might have for episodes. And lastly, make sure you go to the website howtodoyour20s.com for the show notes, because in the show notes I'll list all the different resources we talked about in this episode, including the tools, the websites, everything. So I hope you enjoyed this episode, and until next time, and until next time, and until next time, and until next time. Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed that video, and if you did, make sure you hit the big red subscribe button down below. You can also check me out on Facebook and on Twitter, and I release a new video every Monday, and by hitting that subscribe button, you'll get those new videos every Monday. And this is really a podcast. It's also a website. You can check out the website. It's howtodoyour20s.com. I'll put a link right over here as well. And what it's all about is trying to improve your life. And we specifically focus on things that people in their 20s are interested in. So make sure you like the video if you liked it. Subscribe. Like us on Facebook and Twitter, whatever. But I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope to see you again on another video.